wife passed away on a Tuesday. I remember it was a Tuesday because I had just taken out the recycling that morning, blue bin to the curb, same as every week for 31 years. And when I came back inside, she was sitting at the kitchen table with her coffee, looking out at the backyard. And she said, "The dogwood is finally blooming." That was the last normal sentence she ever said to me. By Friday, she was gone. Ovarian cancer. The kind that hides quietly for years, then announces itself when it's already too late to argue. We had 8 months from diagnosis to funeral. 8 months is long enough to say everything you need to say, and still somehow not long enough. Her name was Joanne. We met in 1987 at a hardware store in Flagstaff, Arizona. She was buying weather stripping. I was buying weather stripping. I was buying the wrong size bolt for a project I didn't know how to finish. She looked at what I had in my hand, looked at the shelf, and without a word handed me the right one. We were married 14 months later, 31 years. That's not just a marriage. That's an entire version of yourself that only exists because of another person. When she died, I didn't fall apart the way people expected me to. I went quiet instead, cooked my own eggs, took walks in the evening, sat on the back porch and watched the dogwood the way she used to. People kept calling to check on me, and I kept telling them I was fine, and they kept not believing me, and honestly, that was exhausting in its own way. My son was the one I thought I could count on. He lives about 40 minutes away, up in Scottsdale. His name is Brett. He married a woman named Corinne 6 years ago, and I want to be fair when I describe her. I really do, but the most honest thing I can say is that from the moment she entered our family, she treated my house like a property she was waiting to inherit. I noticed it at Thanksgiving dinners, the way she'd walk through the living room and touch things, the antique credenza Joanne found at an estate sale, the framed map of Arizona I got from my father, not admiring them, assessing them. Joanne noticed too. She mentioned it to me once, carefully, the way she always brought up difficult things. "I'm not saying she's a bad person," Joanne said. "I'm saying she thinks about the future more than the present." She smiled when she said it. That was Joanne, always giving people the most charitable version of themselves. I should have paid more attention to that conversation. For the first few weeks after Joanne's funeral, I was mostly left alone. People brought food. Friends from church came by. My neighbor Ray, who has known me for 20 years, sat on the back porch with me 2 or 3 evenings a week and didn't say much, and that was exactly right. Brett called regularly, said the right things. "Dad, we're here for you, whatever you need." I believed him. Then, 9 days after we buried Joanne, he and Corinne came over on a Sunday afternoon unannounced. I was in the garage when they pulled up. I heard the car door, walked out to meet them, and the first thing I noticed was that Corinne had a large tote bag and a slightly too composed expression, the kind you wear when you've rehearsed what you're about to say. We sat in the living room. Brett did most of the talking at first. He said he'd been doing a lot of thinking. He said he was worried about me living alone in a 4-bedroom house. He said the property taxes on this neighborhood had gotten significant and that, from a financial standpoint, it might be worth looking at alternatives. Then Corinne reached into her tote bag and pulled out a folder. Inside were printed pages from 3 different assisted living communities in the Phoenix metro area. Color-coded tabs. She'd highlighted monthly pricing. One of them had a photograph on the cover of 2 elderly people smiling at a jigsaw puzzle. And I remember staring at that photo and feeling something go very still inside me. "We did a lot of research," she said. "This one in Peoria is really well reviewed, and if you sold the house now while the market is strong, you'd have more than enough to cover it for years." I looked at my son. He was looking at the folder, not at me. I asked him if he thought 9 days was long enough to have this conversation. He said he thought it was better to be proactive. He used the word proactive. His mother had been in the ground for 9 days, and he used the word proactive. I told them I appreciated their concern. I said I needed time to think. They left after about 40 minutes, and I stood at the front window and watched their car pull out of the driveway, and then I went to the kitchen and stood there for a long time not doing anything. What I didn't tell them What I didn't tell anyone was that 3 days earlier, I'd had a meeting with a man named Phil Carver. Phil was the attorney Joanne had been working with quietly for the past several years. He'd called me the day after the funeral, introduced himself, and asked if I could come in at my earliest convenience. I figured it was standard estate paperwork. I wasn't prepared for what he actually showed me. Joanne had, over the course of 11 years, been setting something aside. She had a small consulting business she ran part-time, grant writing for nonprofits mostly. I knew about the work, but I never paid close attention to the income because she handled her own finances and I handled mine, and we split the household bills down the middle the way we'd always done. I trusted her completely. I didn't scrutinize. What I didn't know was that for 11 years, she had been setting aside a portion of her consulting income into a separate account, then gradually, carefully, purchasing property. Not a big purchase, not a flashy investment. A small cabin on 5 acres in the White Mountains of Arizona, up near Pine Top Lakeside, an hour and 40 minutes from Flagstaff. She bought the land first in 2012, paid cash over several years, then had a modest cabin built on it in 2016. Fully paid off, utilities connected, deeded entirely in my name. Phil slid the deed across the desk to me and I sat there reading my own name on it, Lawrence Harold Gifford. And I felt something I genuinely cannot describe. Not just surprise. Something deeper than that. Like discovering a room in a house you've lived in your whole life that you somehow never opened. There was a letter too. Phil said she'd left it with the paperwork specifically for me to read after she was gone. He stepped out to give me privacy. I won't share everything she wrote. Some of it is mine to keep. But she said she'd started putting this together after a conversation we had early in our marriage, when I mentioned offhand that I'd always wanted a place in the mountains. A quiet place, somewhere with trees and no obligations. She said she never forgot that, and she decided a long time ago that if anything happened to her first, she wasn't going to leave me stranded. She was going to leave me somewhere to go. She also said, and this was the part that made me put the letter down for a few minutes and just breathe. She said she had a feeling the hardest part wouldn't be the grief. It would be the people who show up after the grief with plans. Joanne always knew things before I did. I drove up to the cabin 2 days after meeting with Phil, before Brett and Corinne came over with their folder. I just wanted to see it. It's a single-story wood-framed cabin with a covered porch facing east toward the tree line. Ponderosa pines, mostly, with some oak mixed in. There's a small creek about 100 yards back that you can hear if it's quiet enough. The inside had been furnished simply. Joanne had made several trips up there over the years, apparently, adding things slowly. A cast-iron pan in the kitchen, a quilt on the bed that I recognized from the cedar chest she kept in our bedroom, one I'd assumed had just been folded away. A rocking chair on the porch that I'd never seen before but that fit so perfectly it seemed like it had been there for decades. I sat in that rocking chair for about 2 hours. I thought about Joanne. I thought about the way she listened when I talked, even when I was saying nothing important. I thought about the fact that she had carried this for 11 years without a word, not because she was keeping a secret, but because she knew me well enough to know I'd try to talk her out of spending the money on something just for me. She didn't give me a gift. She gave me an exit, already built, already paid for, already waiting. I drove back to Flagstaff and said nothing to anyone. When Brett and Corinne came over 9 days after the funeral with their folder, I sat in my own living room and listened to them talk about market values and monthly care costs, and I was as calm as I have ever been in my life. Because I already knew something they didn't. Because Joanne had already answered this question for me years before it was ever asked. After they left, I called Phil, and we began the paperwork. Not to sell the house. I wasn't going to do that on anyone else's timeline. But to update my own documents, to make sure everything was properly titled, and to begin making quiet arrangements. I told no one, not Ray, not my brother in Denver, not my daughter-in-law's mother, who had the habit of calling me with helpful suggestions. Nobody. Over the next 3 weeks, I did what needed to be done slowly and without announcement. I arranged for a property management company to rent out my Flagstaff house, a friend of Phil's who handled exactly this kind of thing. Good tenants, reliable income, nothing sold, nothing given away. The house would be there if I ever wanted to come back. But I wasn't selling it, not on Corinne's timeline, not ever if I could help it. I packed what mattered, which turned out to be less than I expected. Some clothes, my tools. I've always kept a decent set of tools, and I wasn't leaving those behind. Joanne's letter, the framed map from my father, the coffee mug I've used every single morning for 12 years, a heavy ceramic thing from a pottery place in Sedona that Joanne bought, and I've never been able to explain why I love it so much. I took the dogwood cutting too. I've been growing a small one in a pot in the garage from a branch. I wasn't leaving that. Brett called during this time, checking in. Normal conversation. I asked about his work. He asked about mine. I'm semi-retired, do some freelance structural consulting, and I told him things were quiet and I was taking it one day at a time. That was true. I just didn't specify which days or where I planned to take them. Corinne called once, separately, which she had never done before. She asked if I'd had a chance to think more about the options they'd shared. I told her I was still processing. That was also true. The last Sunday in October, I loaded my truck, drove by the cemetery to say goodbye to Joanne, which felt right and necessary and not at all dramatic, and then I drove east on Highway 260 toward the mountains. It was late afternoon when I arrived. The aspens had turned and there were patches of yellow in the tree line above the cabin. The creek was running. The porch was cold, but not too cold. I sat in the rocking chair and watched the sky change from blue to orange to the particular dark that comes in the mountains, which is darker and cleaner than anywhere else I know. I had cell service, but I didn't check my phone. I made dinner from what I brought. Pasta, nothing fancy, and I ate at the small table by the window, and I didn't feel lonely exactly. I felt like myself for the first time in a long time. 3 days later, Brett called. He'd apparently driven by the Flagstaff house and noticed my truck wasn't there. He called again, then texted, then Corinne texted, then my brother's wife texted, which told me someone had been making calls. I let a full day go by before I responded. Not to be cruel, just because I needed that day to be mine without anyone else's panic in it. When I did call Brett back, I kept it simple. I told him I'd moved to a cabin in the White Mountains for a while, that Joanne had left it to me, that the Flagstaff house was being managed by a rental company and was not for sale, that I was fine. There was a long pause on the phone. He said, "What cabin? I didn't know there was a cabin." I said, "I know." Another pause. He said, "Were you going to tell us?" I thought about Joanne's letter, about her line about the people who show up with plans, about the 11 years she'd spent quietly building this without telling a soul. I said, "I'm telling you now." Corinne must have been in the room because I could hear murmuring in the background. Then Brett came back on and said they needed to come up and see the place, make sure I was settled in properly. I told him he was welcome to visit whenever he wanted to call ahead. He did come up about 2 weeks later, without Corinne, which surprised me. He sat on the porch with me for most of a Saturday. He's a quiet person when she's not around, something I'd actually forgotten, because they're rarely apart at family events. We drank coffee and watched 2 mule deer walk through the tree line, slow and unbothered, and Brett said, "Mom found this place?" I said, "Yes." He said, "She never said a word." I said, "No, she didn't." He looked out at the trees for a while. Then he said, "I'm sorry about the folder." Just like that. No qualification, no. But we were just trying to help. Just the apology, clean and plain. It was the most his mother's son he'd sounded in years, and I told him so, and he laughed a little, which broke something loose in both of us. We didn't talk about Corinne. We didn't talk about the house or the market or assisted living brochures. We just talked the way a father and son are supposed to talk, about ordinary things, until the light went and we went inside for dinner. He drove back to Scottsdale that evening. Before he left, he hugged me in the driveway, longer than usual, and said, "She really loved you, Dad." I told him I knew. I said she was the smartest person I've ever been in a room with, and that's saying something because I've been in a lot of rooms. He smiled. He looked like her when he smiled. He always has, since he was small. That was 3 months ago. I'm still at the cabin. The winter here is nothing like Flagstaff's winters. Quieter, more snow, better quality of silence. I've started working on the porch railing, which needed reinforcing. I've been teaching myself to bake bread badly, but improving. Ray drove up 2 weekends ago and we went fishing at the reservoir and caught nothing and had an excellent time. My consulting work I do from the kitchen table 3 mornings a week, which is enough to stay useful without being consumed by it. The Flagstaff house has good tenants, a couple from California, a teacher, and a physical therapist. They sent a note asking if they could plant a small garden in the backyard. I said yes, of course, and asked only that they leave the dogwood alone. I planted my cutting in a pot on the cabin porch. It survived the transplant. Joanne would have been satisfied by that. I think about her every day, which I expected. What I didn't expect was how often I'd feel her specifically in this place more than I do at home. It makes sense, I suppose. She built this for me. She thought about what I would need before I needed it. She made decisions across 11 years of Tuesdays and Saturdays and ordinary afternoons, so that when the worst day came, I'd have somewhere solid to stand. That's what I've been thinking about most, actually. Not the cabin itself. The time it represents, the unspoken attention, the fact that she kept this whole thing in her head, managed it, paid it off, furnished it carefully, and never once let on. Not because she wanted a secret, but because she understood that the value of it was in the surprise, in arriving somewhere that was already home. I never thanked her for her while she was alive because I didn't know. But I try to say it out loud sometimes, sitting in the rocking chair in the morning with my coffee, watching the light come through the pines. The dogwood is going to bloom again in the spring. I'll be here when it does, and whoever comes with a folder will find that I've already made my arrangements. I've been sitting with this story for a while now, trying to figure out what it actually means. Not just what happened, but why it landed the way it did. And I keep coming back to the same thing. The people who hurt you rarely think they're doing anything wrong. Brett didn't wake up one morning and decide to be cruel. Corinne didn't drive over with that folder thinking, I'm going to betray this man while he's still wearing black. They genuinely believed they were being practical. That's almost the harder part to sit with, but here's what I've come to understand. There's a difference between what people intend and what they reveal. When my son walked through my front door 9 days after we buried his mother and started talking about market values, he wasn't showing me his intentions. He was showing me what he'd been thinking about while I was sitting at the cemetery. And that kind of truth, the kind that comes out sideways, through a color-coded folder, you can't unsee it once you've seen it. Joanne understood this. She spent 31 years watching people closely, and I think she knew that the real test of a person isn't how they behave when things are going well. It's what they reach for when there's something to gain. She didn't leave me the cabin because she was afraid of Brett. She left it to me because she understood that I would need somewhere to stand that nobody else had a claim on. That kind of clarity, knowing what someone will need before they know it themselves, that's not just love. That's wisdom built out of decades of paying attention. What I keep thinking about is the 11 years. 11 years of ordinary days of consulting invoices and small deposits and quiet trips up to the mountains that I didn't ask about because I trusted her completely. She wasn't building a secret. She was building a solution. There's a profound kind of intelligence in that. The willingness to do unglamorous, patient work for an outcome you may never live to see. Most people want credit for what they do. Joanne wanted results. Those are very different motivations, and they produce very different lives. And as for me, I had to decide what kind of man I was going to be in the middle of all this. Not the dramatic version where I confronted my son in the driveway, not the bitter version where I cut him off without a word, just a man who got quiet when he needed to get quiet, moved when it was time to move, and left the door open for the people worth keeping. Brett came back. He sat on my porch without Corinne and he said, I'm sorry, like he meant it. And I believed him, because he looked like his mother when he said it. That's the thing about character. It doesn't disappear. It just gets buried sometimes under other people's influence, other people's plans. The work of a life is to find your way back to it. I don't know what's coming next. I know I have a porch and a rocking chair and a dogwood cutting that survived a hard winter. I know that Joanne did something extraordinary with 11 years of ordinary effort. And I know that the people who show up with folders will always exist, in every life, in every family. The question is whether you have somewhere solid to stand when they arrive. I do now.